Assalamu alaikum. We will do lecture 28 today, and we will study another postmodern poet in today's lecture. In the previous lectures, I was discussing William Butler Yeats with you, and we saw how William Butler Yeats is a poet who employs lots of symbols in his poetry. He is the poet belonging to this postmodern tradition. In fact, he was a poet writing between the two world wars, and we saw how heavily he was influenced by this French symbolist tradition, which had such a greater role to play in and after the modern era. And many of the literary writers, including poets, novelists, and prose writers, they were more and more producing a kind of literature that was elusive and that employed heavy symbols. So multiple interpretations were possible for a particular literary work. But and we saw that with Yeats. When we looked at the last poem, I told you how in different ways the poem could be read, and how we can form various opinions about the poem. How Yeats himself intended the poem to have multiple meanings, because each of the symbols that he used, they evoked different interpretations, different senses. Sometimes they could be easily attached or referred to the Irish folklore, or they could be attached to the Christian myths, or they could be attached to the classical myths, or we could have the mythical interpretation, as Yeats himself belonged to a mythical group. So such is the beauty of the symbol. But alongside this desire of the poets to use elusive language in the form of symbols in their poetry, we also saw that the meter, the rhythm, and the diction, they had also become more musical. The poets also loved to employ alliterations, assonance, consonants, to emphasize or to enhance the beauty of their verse. So this symbolist lyricism was a strong part of Yeats's poetry, although apparently it was it was simple in language, but there is this beauty. There is this beauty in these postmodern poets, which sort of harmonizes, which gives out a complete meaning as a result of the total effect of the form and the content. And this is why, although these postmodern writers, they sometimes evade the readers, and they sometimes are not able to communicate the depths of their feelings or the depths of the meanings to their readers, yet their poems are marked by a beauty which is a result of this harmony between the content and the form, between the ideas and the physical form of the poem. The poem that I'm going to discuss with you today is Philip Arthur Larkin, a British poet. And he's also a postmodern poet. And he has all the qualities of the postmodern poet. And you shall see, in fact, that he belongs to this postmodern tradition, and the qualities that I've just discussed with you that were part of Yeats's poetry, you shall also find them in his poetry. You shall find him belonging to the symbolist tradition in the history of English literature, and you shall see that his poetry is highly lyrical. There is a balance in his poetry. There is rhythm in his poetry. There are these beautiful rhymes in his poetry. So the poems, apparently, simple, colloquial, and employing themes from everyday life, or talking about things of everyday life, but yet they employ symbols. They create images which become symbolic. and which becomes symbolic of sometimes the poet's own feelings. And there we discern a contrast between the apparent and the outer meaning of the poem and the inner and the deeper skepticism or cynicism of the poet. So there is this irony that is lurking and working beneath the surface of the poems in these postmodern poets. We shall find how apparently simple poem of Larkin is an ironic judgment upon the world, upon the social life, or upon the other institutions. So these are some of the hallmarks of these postmodern poets. Let us now begin the detailed discussion on Philip Arthur Larkin. Then I shall discuss this one poem, An Arundel Tomb, with you also in today's lecture. But let us see formally what do we know about the poet, or what is it that you need to know about the poet. Now, Philip Arthur Larkin was born in August 9, 1922 in Warwickshire, England, and he died in December the 2nd, 1985, Kingston upon Hull. So the poet born in the period between the two wars, and he started most of the poetry that he wrote was after the Second World War. So a poet who represents the postmodern tradition exclusively and completely is Philip Arthur Larkin. He's the most representative and highly regarded of the post-war British poets, who gave expression to a clipped, anti-romantic sensibility prevalent in English verse in the 1950s. So he is a prominent post-war British poet, and we shall see when we study his poetry how clipped, crisp, and piquant are his verses. And he introduces a more realistic kind of poetry, which is described as anti-romantic sensibility. And he was a poet, he was a novelist, and also a distinguished jazz and literary critic in his times. His first published poem, Ultimatum, appeared in The Listener in 1940 when Larkin was 18 years of age. So from a very early age he started composing poetry, and his first work that was to be published was a novel, as you shall see. The next point says, neither his first published verse collection, The North Ship, published in 1945, nor his novels, Jill, published in 1946, and A Girl in Winter, published in 1947, received much critical acclaim. It was his second collection of poems, The Less Deceived, published by the Hull-based Marvel Press, that brought him fame in 1955. This was followed by The Whitsun Weddings in 1964 and High Windows in 1974. So these later works brought him fame, and they are his renowned works. So his later collection of poems with the title The Less Deceived brought him immediate acclaim and honor and fame. And then his poems, The Whitsun Weddings and The High Windows, they brought him fame. We shall study this other poem, The Whitsun Weddings, in the next lecture too. And in 2003, almost 2 decades after his death, Larkin was chosen as the nation's best loved poet. In a survey by the Poetry Book Society in 2008, the Times named Larkin as the greatest British post-war writer. So his fame increased after his death. He did, his work was acknowledged in his lifetime also. He achieved fame and respect in his lifetime also. But after his death, his work became more and more famous with the critics and the literary critics. His poems show influence of W.H. Auden, W.B. Yeats, and Thomas Hardy in the flexibility of verse form and high structure. So he seems to have learned a lot from these three poets, because we see that their qualities are exhibited in his own work. There is flexibility of the verse form, and the structure is also that he employs. His poems are tightly structured. They're strictly structured. So he sticks to a form. His form, his structure is not loose, yet we discern a flexibility in the verse form, and a quality that we shall study later on, but I feel I can mention it today, which is called enjambment. Enjambment, E-N-J-A-M-B-E-M-E-N-T. This is a poetic device in poetry which Yeats also employed, and which we shall see Larkin also employs. In this poetic device, a poetic line or a verse in a poem, it does not end in a line. The thought or the sentence continues in the next line, and it may end in the middle of the next sentence. So this continuity and this kind of narrative pattern, which is described as a flexibility of verse form, this is an important feature of these postmodern poets. His poetry is characterized as colloquial. You shall see that he writes in the colloquial language. He uses colloquial words and diction, and his topics are of everyday nature. And he's reflective. He's thinking. He's talking about everyday things, objects, but his poetry is reflective. It makes us think. It is ironic also, and I told you there are those gaps in what he is saying and what he intends, and so there is this irony hidden in his poems, but he also comes out as a skeptic. He's a cynic and a skeptic in most of the poems. We should not confuse it with pessimism, but there is this tendency to doubt, tendency not to be so jubilant about things, and he's also highly symbolic, and these are yet again the characteristics of the postmodern poets. Now, some of the critics' remarks regarding Larkin, because he's a modern poet, so we do have some criticism available to us, so I've included it in this lecture. Now, Jane Hartley summed his style up as a piquant mixture of lyricism and discontent. And this ambivalence is the hallmark of Larkin's poetry. You must remember that, and this point will often be repeated by different critics, as you shall see later on. But it is this ambivalence, it is this ambivalent attitude that we discover in his poems, which is described as the mixture of lyricism and discontent. We find this beauty in form, the beauty in the verse form, the beauty in the lyric, but the content of the poem displays some discontent. So these opposites, these paradoxes, these conflicts, this conflict in form and this conflict in form and content, this gives rise to the ambivalence, and this shows the ambivalent attitude of the poet. Terence Hawkes has argued that while most of the poems in the North's Ship are metaphoric in nature, heavily indebted to Yeats's symbolist lyrics, the subsequent development of Larkin's mature style is not a movement from Yeats to Hardy, but rather a surrounding of the Yeatsian moment within a Hardy-esque frame. What Terence Hawkes is implying is that there is not a shift in Larkin's poems from Yeats to Hardy or vice versa. In fact, he's saying there is no shift from Yeats to Hardy, from the symbolism of Yeats to the lyricism of Hardy, but he says there is a mixture of the two. So in his poems he displays influence of both the poets. There is a symbolism of Yeats and there is the lyricism of Hardy's work. So he employs them both in his poems. And in Hawkes's view, Larkin's poetry revolves around two losses. The loss of modernism, which manifests itself in the desire to find a moment of epiphany. and the loss of England, or rather the loss of the British Empire, which requires England to define itself in its own terms when previously it could define Englishness in opposite to something else. So Hawkes also says that there are two themes that are apparent in Larkin's poetry. One, he says, is the loss of modernism, and when he says this, he means that we find in his poems the desire to find an epiphany. An epiphany is something that we relate with joys, and it's a psychological term, but it means the moment of realization, the moment of truth, the moment of sudden enlightenment, when the things become clear to you and you can resolve your issues or the problems. So he says we find in his poems a desire for that kind of a realization or enlightenment, or that spiritual awakening that would end all problems. So there is this desire in him. And then he says there is this, the second theme is that of the loss, the feeling of loss of glory of England. After the World Wars, England had become an lesser power because most parts had been destroyed, and it had to share, and it had to give up some of the colonies that it was that were under its rule, also including our own part of the world, the subcontinent. So he says was this loss in glory in English form. Previously, this Englishness was viewed in opposition to everything else, but now he says we have to find our own identity. So it is this search for the English identity, for the new English identity, that we find in Larkin's poetry. So these are the two themes that he says we can find in Larkin's poetry. Now a little bit about the poet. Larkin's poetry is often seen as typically ambivalent, with their prolonged debates with despair, contrasted with the energy of the language and form, which give them transcendent beauty. This is the same point that I discussed with you earlier on. We find this ambivalence in his poetry. We find that the content is skeptic, and there is a lot of cynicism in the poem, but the energy of the language and the beauty of the form is also there. So there is this, the ugliness is contrasted with the beauty. The ugliness of, or the discontentment or despair of the content is contrasted with the beauty or energy of the or lyricism of the language. And this is what is described as the ambivalence in Larkin's poetry. Larkin's writing style identify him as a modernist. This is also something that I've already discussed with you, but I will now look at some of the formally, in fact, I just gave a casual overview of the modernist tradition, but now formally some of the key features of modernist tradition. Larkin's writing style identify him as a modernist. He is more and more seen as a poet of high standing. Tijana Trojkovic writes, Philip Larkin is an excellent example of the plain style in modern times. Then Stephen Regan notes in an essay entitled Philip Larkin, a late modern poet, that Larkin frequently embraces devices associated with the experimental practices of modernism, such as linguistic strangeness, self-conscious literariness, radical self-questioning, sudden shifts of voice and register, complex viewpoints and perspectives, and symbolist intensity. Now these are the features, formal features of the modernist tradition. He says these are all these devices, they are all embraced in Larkin's poetry, and they are the linguistic strangeness. When he says that, it means the flexibility. He's talking about the flexibility of the verse form, the way he uses, composes his verse, the way he links the lines, the verse lines. He says, so there is a strangeness about his poetry that we do not associate with the previous poets. And self-conscious literariness. the choice of words and the choice of diction, the choice of symbols, images is self-conscious, carefully chosen. Radical self-questioning. We see this reflective tone in his poems. Sudden shifts of voice and register, and this is a very, very postmodern phenomena, where we see often oftentimes an abrupt shift in voices. Sometimes two, three, or more voices are used in one literary work, and there is this shift in voices and register. Complex viewpoints and perspectives, and symbolist intensity. This you already understand. And again, another definition for you about modernism. It evolved from the romantic rejection of Enlightenment positivism and faith in reason. So it was a rejection of the values of Enlightenment and the Romantic tradition. Modernist writers broke with the Romantic pieties and cliches, and they became self-consciously skeptical of language and its claims on coherence. So we see with these modern writers that they are skeptic. There is cynicism and skepticism that we find in their works, and they are skeptical not just of values and traditions, but they are also skeptical of the language. And in the early 20th century, novelists such as Henry James and Virginia Woolf, and later Joseph Conrad, experimented with shifts in time and narrative points of view. If you're aware of these novelists, you would understand how they experimented with shifts in time. In the postmodern era, time became irrelevant. You wouldn't understand when you're reading any one of these novelists' works, whether they're talking about the past or the present. There is no direct break between the past, present, or the future. As the thoughts come to the character's mind, they are revealed to us. So the time is no longer linear. It doesn't move in one direction, past and then present and then future, but it is all mixed up. And we see that they're shifting in the narrative points of view. Sometimes we are told about what is going on in the mind of one character, and then we enter the mind of the other character, the consciousness of one character, and then the consciousness of the other character. So the points of views, voices also keep changing. While T.S. Eliot wrote The Waste Land in the shadow of World War I, shortly after The Waste Land was published in 1922, it became the archetypical modernist text, rife with allusions, linguistic fragments, and mixed registers and languages. So this became the first work to introduce the modernist tradition. Other poets most often associated with modernism include Auden, Crane, William Butler Yeats, and Wallace Stevens. And let us now briefly look what the poem is going to hold for us. The poem, which was written in 1956 and was published in the Wits and Weddings collection, is actually based on an actual stone monument located in Chichester Cathedral. So it is based on an actual stone monument, something that Larkin had actually seen and witnessed, and then he composed a poem on it. The Arundel of the title refers to the nearby town of Arundel, an ancient Roman town lying in a prominent position in hills overlooking the river Arun. Larkin had clearly seen the monument for himself, for the poem is characterized by the sense of the observer who looks at the monument, walks around it, and begins to notice features as he looks. So this is just a brief overview for you of how the poem is developed. So Larkin visits this place, sees the monument for himself, and is observing this monument as an objective observer, walks around it, takes a deep look at it, and notices its features. In the poem, Larkin appreciates that he is only one of a huge number of visitors. So he appears to us as one of the visitors of this monument across many generations. So he does tell us that for generations now, people have been visiting this place and have been admiring this monument. So across many generations who have come into the cathedral for purposes of worship, for spiritual guidance and consolation, or simply out of curiosity. The monument is located in the western part of the cathedral in a side nave with the two figures lying together, lit by a changing pattern of light and shadow within the cathedral. So this detail is important, as you shall also study about it in the poem. What is this monument? This monument is about two figures, full-length figures, and two statues, in fact, lying together, face upwards towards the sky, and lit by a changing pattern of light and shadow within the cathedral. So these bodies, these effigies, are inside the cathedral, and they are lying side by side. The figures which lie side by side on top of the tomb are Richard Fitzalan, Earl of the Arundel, and his Countess. So these figures that have been etched, that have been created there, are in the memory of the Earl of Arundel and his Countess. And their effigies, their bodies, or the figures, they are drawn, they are made, they are created on top of their tomb. A copy of Larkin's poem is now placed at the base of the statue so that the modern day visitor can have a direct experience of both the poem and the effigy. So you see, the significance of the poem also lies in the fact that the poem is now also to be found at that place. And so it's not just a monument, but it is also Larkin's poem, which has now attained this eternal status. One of the distinctive features of the poem as a whole is that it uses extremely elaborate images and phrases to suggest the paradoxes and ambiguities about love, human nature, and fidelity which run throughout the poem. This is just an important insight into the poem. You shall see that the poet employs elaborate images, and there are phrases, and there are paradoxes and ambiguities, and he shows these paradoxes, and he shows his paradoxical attitude towards love, towards human nature, and faithfulness or fidelity. The poem is written in 7 stanzas, each having 6 lines. The rhyme scheme follows the pattern A, B, B, C, A, C. So in other words, we have this the 4 lines, first 4 lines having the rhyme scheme A, B, B, C, and then we have a couplet A, C. The rhythm of the poem is symbolic of the slow, inexorable passage of time. We shall see that in the poem, the poet is obsessed with the passing of time. So this idea of passing of time is also revealed through the slow rhythm of the poem, and also described through the 2 effigies which lie motionless side by side. Let us now look at the poem and see how Larkin comes out as a powerful postmodernist poet. So stanza 1. Side by side, their faces blurred, the Earl and Countess lie in stone, their proper habits vaguely shown. So in these lines, or in fact in the opening stanza, Larkin gives us a literal description of these stone effigies, of the 2 figures which are lying side by side on top of their tomb. But he tells us that their faces are blurred, they are lying side by side. They are lying close to each other, and these are 2 huge statues. One is a statue of a male who is the Earl of Arundel, and the other is a statue of a female who is his Countess. So these statues or these tombs are side by side, and these statues are lying on their backs. They are created on their backs with their face looking towards the skies. So in that posture, he says, they lie side by side, but he says their faces are not clear. Their faces are blurred. Their faces are not distinct, not clear. The Earl and Countess lie in stone. And he tells you clearly who they are. He says one is the Earl and the other is the Countess, and they are in stone. They are the statues. Their proper habits vaguely shown. Now, proper habits are their clothes. He says their formal and dignified clothings are also vaguely shown. The dresses that they are wearing are also are done by the sculptor. If you look at the three lines, you can see that the rhythm is of the lines is slow. The lines are also are simple. They are not complex, and they are in the colloquial tone. They have this colloquial, everyday tone. This is the characteristic feature of Larkin. But we shall see as the poem progresses, so shall the experimentation with the verse form shall continue. So this line is a continuation of the previous line when he says their proper habits vaguely shown as jointed armor, stiffened pleat, and that faint hint of the absurd, the little dogs under their feet. He says their clothes are shown as jointed armor. Now the male figure, the Earl, is dressed in armor. He's wearing his armor, and this is why he's described as jointed, because the armor is a dress that the soldiers normally wear and used to wear in those times, the 16th and the 17th centuries, and it appears as if it is jointed at different places. So he says the body of the Earl is wearing the dress that is as a jointed armor. And the stiffened pleat, this phrase is used for the description of the Countess's dress, that she is dressed by the sculptor in stiff garment. So her dress is has got stiff pleats, has got stiff and neat pleats on her clothes. The little dogs under their feet. Now he adds this last line, and he says there is this absurdity about this whole scene. And what is that absurdity? He says there is this faint hint of absurd, the little dogs under their feet, and at their feet small dogs are represented. They are also etched. Their figures are also drawn. So he is saying that they look absurd in the presence of these two great figures. These little dogs appear absurd. In the stanza 2, he describes the monument further. He says, such plainness of the pre-Baroque hardly involves the eye until it meets his left-hand gauntlet. Now, such plainness of the pre-Baroque, Baroque was a style in art and architecture famous in Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries. He says this plainness of the pre-Baroque times, he's talking about the times prior to this age or style in arts and architecture, before 17th and 18th centuries. He says this plainness, the simplicity of this monument is reminiscent, it reminds the observers of the pre-Baroque times. And he says it hardly involves the eye. He says it has got nothing remarkable or pleasing about it until it meets his left-hand gauntlet. So he says the monument itself, or the plainness, or the plainness of this statues, of this monument, he says, has got nothing to captivate the eyes, has got nothing interesting to offer It is so plainly built, it is so plain in style, and so that is why he says it is not captivating, it is not interesting enough. But he says, until the eye meets the left hand gauntlet. Gauntlet is a protective glove that was worn by the warriors in those times. So he says they were, the monument was not typical, was a typical monument. It had nothing special about it. It was not remarkable. But there was a remarkable feature about this monument, and that was the left hand that was carrying, that was wearing the protective glove. And he says, still clasped empty in the other. And one sees with a sharp, tender shock his hand withdrawn, holding her hand. So he says that this act of the Earl, it surprises the poet. It has captivated his attention, and he creates a sharp feeling of tenderness in him, because he sees that with one hand, with his left hand, he has, the Earl has removed his gauntlet. He's removed his warrior glove, and he's carrying it in his left arm, and in his right empty hand, with his right empty hand, he's holding the hand of his countess. And this is what is described by the poet as a sharp, tender shock. And look at the beauty of the line. Look at the repetition of the sh sound, sharp and shock, sharp, tender shock. He says at once, and there is this oxymoron also. There are two opposite two opposite words are linked. He says it is this this monument or this act is it is sharp as well as tender, and it gives us a shock. His hand withdrawn, holding her hand. So the stiffness of his verse, or the dryness that we find in the opening 3-4 lines, that gives way now to a gentleness and to a warmth when he notices the Earl clasping the hands of his countess. And that is shown through this soft alliterative use of the her sound, the sh sound, sh. So he says the sharp shock. Ho, and then is a her sound, his hand withdrawn, holding her hand. You see the her sound is repeated in the last line. So giving way to the softness. And again you see enjambment, as I mentioned earlier on, and oxymoron, both are used. An enjambment you can see in the first line, and one sees with a sharp, tender shock, his hand withdrawn, holding her hand, full stop, that's fine. But you see the class empty in the other, then a break. So these pauses, when they occur in the middle of the line, that is what we call enjambment. They would not think to lie so long, such faithfulness in effigy was just a detail friends would see. He says they would not think to lie so long. Stanza 3 begins with what the poet assumes must the Earl and the Countess would have thought. He says they would not have thought that this act of love, this act of faithfulness on their part, it would attract so much attention, and they would remain here, and they would become the focus of attention of visitors for such a long time. There's also this passing of time, passing of centuries, passing of generations that is implied here. Such faithfulness in effigy. Now there is irony hidden in these lines. He says such faithfulness in effigy. So he says these are made of stone. These are statues of stone, and they display faithfulness. It's been centuries, it's been generations that they have been lying like this, and for centuries and for generations and for a long passing time, they have always been holding their each other's hands. So he says they have shown remarkable faithfulness and honesty with each other. And the irony is suggested here. He means that this phenomenon is unique because it is not to be expected, it is not found amongst human beings generally. And we also have this feeling of skepticism and cynicism that is so strongly felt in Larkin's poems. He comes out as a cynic, as a skeptic here. He doubts the faithfulness of ordinary men and women, and he's shocked when he sees it being displayed by statues made of stone. See, such faithfulness in effigy was just a detail friends would see. He says this thing or this act, this was something that was meant only for their friends to admire. Only their friends could have understood them, the people who knew them, who knew about their love, who knew how faithful they were to each other. These details are only meant for their close friends. But he says now they have become, their effigies, their statues have become a monument. So they are now viewed and open for all the visitors and spectators. A sculptor's sweet commission grace thrown off in helping to prolong the Latin names around the base. A sculptor's sweet commission grace thrown off in helping to prolong the Latin names around the base. Now his cynicism comes back again. He says this was not maybe an act of faithfulness on the part of the Earl and the Countess only. It was a sculptor's idea. It was a sculptor's sweet commissioned grace, he says. So this intimate detail, this act of love and faithfulness, this was only a whim of the sculptor. Or maybe this, there was no love, there was no honesty between the two, but it was a sculptor's idea. Maybe he just thought that he needs to give it a warm gesture, to show some warmth. So this is a cynicism that is prominent, such a prominent feature of Larkin's works. So he says, thrown off in helping to prolong the Latin names around the base. So the thrown off means a casual act. It was just the whim or the casual act of the sculptor. And he says the actual task of the sculptor was to preserve the Latin names at the end or at the base of the statues. He says that was his actual task, and this holding of the hands, this act of love and faithfulness that he has displayed, it was just an afterthought, it was just a casual act. So not the main theme, but the main theme or the main focus were the Latin names at the end of the base, but this was just an afterthought, it was just a second thought, it was secondary. So he himself shows this surprise, the shock upon seeing this act of love and faithfulness, and then he himself, in a reflective manner, he dismisses it. He dismisses the idea of faithfulness and love. Now in stanza 4, he says, they would no guess how early in their supine stationary voyage the air would change to soundless damage. Now the stanza offers you a description of the time change as well as a change in the structure of the poem. Supine means lying on the back, face upwards. He says that they would no guess how early, they could not have guessed. This earl or this monument, this earl and his partner, they could never have guessed that they would have gone on this stationary voyage in this posture, lying in this manner. They would have gone on a journey upon time, a journey on time, that they would have passed generations, they would have passed centuries while remaining stationary, while remaining immobile. So he's describing how this monument passed covered distances in time, and many centuries have gone by, but it has remained the same. It's you can compare it to the same theme of eternity of art, of this temporariness of human life, but this forever eternal quality of art, the long lasting. So it's the same thing that he says, that it has been there for centuries, it has been there for generations in the same supine stationary position, but it has been on a voyage. The voyage in the sense it has stayed there, it has remained stationary, but generations of mankind have passed, and the different phases of time have gone by, and everyone has been able to admire the beauty of this monument. But he says they could never have imagined that they would have lived this long, or they would have journeyed thus far. He says the air would change to soundless damage, meaning he's saying they would not have guessed that even the air around them would have changed. So in their times the air was clean, unpolluted, but now there is this hidden reference to the Industrial Revolution and the pollution that is caused by the Industrial Revolution. So he says the air would change to soundless damage. To even the air is now causing, he says, a soundless damage. It is eroding the statues, it is eroding the walls, it is eroding monuments, because it is now polluted. Turn the old tenantry away. How soon succeeding eyes begin to look, not read. He says they could never have imagined. They could have never have imagined, and they could never have changed their positions. They could never have, they would never have been able to do anything else. They would never have been able to change their tenantry position. Tenantry refers to the status of being a tenant. And so he says they could never have looked for another place to be, or to change their place, because the air around here have become polluted. So for them it was to stay in the same place, to remain the tenants in the same place, in the same cathedral. How soon succeeding eyes begin to look, not read. He says the succeeding, again he's talking about the passing time, succeeding eyes. The succeeding eyes of generations of men, succeeding eyes of people, visitors who from centuries have visited this monument. He says, and they have, how soon they begin to look, nor read. Again he's saying he's referring to this act of love and faithfulness that caught the attention of the visitors of the people, and not the Latin names written at the base of the effigies. Rigidly they, he says, rigidly they, and you see this is enjambment. Now the sentence is broken in the middle, and then it will be completed in a few lines, in the next few lines. He says, rigidly they persisted, linked through lengths and breadths of time, full stop. This is enjambment. So, and this is the flexibility of the verse form. And only the poet knows why and how he's to go about it. We cannot decide that. So the previous stanza continues the words, and in the next stanza the sentence is eventually complete. So he says, rigidly they persisted, linked through lengths and breadths of time. This monument, it has persisted. These statues, they have persisted rigidly, he tells us, but they have been linked through lengths and breadths of time. So he says they have survived centuries, they have survived a lot. Snow fell undated. Light each summer thronged the grass. A bright litter of bird calls strewed the same bone-littered ground, and up the paths the endless altered people came. He just gives you a description of what these statues have been through, what changes in nature this monument has witnessed. He says, snow, it saw snow and light and summer season thronged with grass. Then the bright litter of bird calls strewed the same bone-littered ground. So the litter of the birds strewn around them, and the bone-littered ground, the bones left by the visitors or the other animals, and up the paths the endless altered people came, and they saw many visitors coming to their place and admire their place. and the lines also display the use of casuras. Casuras is a pause in the middle of the line, and it is linked naturally with the enjambment. And the casuras are used to show the passage of time, and each pause is a century or another generation. Like here he says snow fell undated, so maybe he's talking about one generation, one passage of time, or one season, which was a season of snow. Then the next time, phase in time, when light each summer thronged the grass. So he's talking maybe another season, another century, another year. So this full stops, these casuras, these full stops, which are enjambments also, but they are casuras, which are pauses. Naturally the stops offer pauses. So he says they have to do with the passage of time. So he employs these techniques, Larkin, he employs these techniques to give us the sense of passing time. In stanza 6, he says, washing at their identity, now helpless in the hollow of an unarmorial age, a trough of smoke in slow suspended skeins above their scrap of history, only an attitude remains. Now, he's here describing how these effigies, they are eroding, how time has left its mark upon them, how time has made them vulnerable, how time has been cruel to them. He says washing at their identity, meaning their identity is being washed away. If you remember the opening lines, he told us that their faces were not distinct, that their faces were not clear, that their faces were blurred and vague. So he says their identities are being washed away. Their garments, their clothes, the lines upon the statues, they are all being washed away by snow, by rain, by corrosive air, by anything, he says. But he says, or just by the passing time. He says, washing at their identity. But if you connect it to what I told you in the beginning about Larkin's desire to find a new identity of Englishness for his country after the wars, you may link it to that theme also. He says, now helpless in the hollow of an unarmorial age. So this, he says, they are now lying helpless. They're lying helpless in this unarmorial age. This modern age is not the age of the armor, because remember the Earl was wearing an armor, is shown wearing an armor. The statue of the Earl is wearing the armor, the jointed armor. So he says they are now lying helpless in this unarmorial age. A trough, so they don't belong here. They don't belong here, they belong to the past. A trough of smoke in slow suspended skeins above their scrap of history. He says they are part of history. They are part of history. They are not part of the present. They are not part of today. There is a trough of smoke, he says, a trough of smoke, and which is suspended in skeins in the history. Skein is a complex tangle of a wool or thread. So we make sometimes a rough a tangle of wool or thread. That is what is called skeins. And a trough is a low atmospheric pressure. This is why he says it also suggests the bend. The trough is also like a hollow cavity in the earth or in the oceans or water. So he says it's as if they lie in a trough of smoke in slow, and they are suspended in the skeins, in the scrap of history. So like skeins, like those complex tangle of wool or thread, he says they are lying in the scrap of history. They are lying in the trough of the scrap of history. Above the scrap of history, only an attitude remains. So he says they are part of history now. They are part of old. They are part of the past now. They do not belong here. They are not part of this age. They are not part of this century. And then in the last line, he gives a strange idea. He says only an attitude remains. And he says they are only special because of this act. They are special because of this act of love and faithfulness. They have lived on, they have passed down history because of this act of love or faithfulness, this attitude that they show towards each other or for each other. So in the next stanza, he says, time has transfigured them into true untruth. The stone fidelity they hardly meant has come to be their final blazon, and to prove our almost instinct, almost true, what will survive of us is love. The same thing that he spoke about in the 6th stanza, he will talk about in this stanza also. He says, although time has transfigured them, time has changed them, time has corrupted them, time has corroded them, time has left its mark on them, and he says they have lost their identity partially as they have passed down the history. He says they have lost their identity, their faces are not distinct, their clothes are not understandable for the people of this century, their dresses appear to be strange. He says, yet they have a link, they have something that they can share with this world also, with the people in these times also. And he says that is the love and the attitude of faithfulness that is being displayed by them. So he says, although time has transfigured them unto untruth, the stone fidelity that they hardly meant has come to be their final blazon. Blazon is a coat of arms, that we wear for a display. But here, he's using it to refer to say that they are their greatest, their coat of arms, the coat of arms, or the tribute that Larkin is paying to them. He says that is the fidelity, that is the faithfulness that is being shown by them, and to prove our almost instinct, almost true, almost instinct and almost true, and what will survive of us is love. And he says they should prove that instinct, which is also true, but he says almost instinct and almost true. The cynicism of Larkin comes out again. This skepticism is obvious here again. He says, so this almost true fact that love survives, that even if through generations everything else is destroyed and corrupted, and the identities are lost, something does survive, and that is the story of love, that is the act of love, that is the attitude of love, that is the attitude of faithfulness. So the poem, as you've seen, is a tribute to faith, to these emotions of love and faithfulness, and it shows how the poet is admiring this monument or admiring these statues for their fidelity. But we also notice throughout the poem how this poet sometimes becomes skeptic and he comes out as a cynic, how he sometimes doubts what he's describing himself. So this is a post-modern tendency where doubts, skepticism, cynicism, they are blended in with truths, and the poets are doubting what they are themselves describing. This is a post-modern tendency. And we also noticed how beautifully the lyric moves, and how it moves like a narrative, and how through the technique of enjambment, the verse is carried forward. Each stanza is linked to the previous one, and yet each stanza contains a whole and a complete meaning, although it is linked to the main idea or to the main theme of the poem at a larger level. So this was how Larkin beautifully engages with these universal themes of love and faithfulness in this poem. Let's look at the brief analysis of the poem now. The poem, as I told you earlier on, was a product of direct experience of the poet, but the poem is very much a poem about love. So he's describing his personal experience, but yet at the same time he's talking about the theme of love. And so one theme of the poem is love. The second point is one of the distinctive features of the poem as a whole is that it uses extremely elaborate and developed patterns of related imagery and phrases to suggest the paradoxes and ambiguities of love, human nature and fidelity which run throughout the poem. I have discussed this point before we read the text of the poem, but I have mentioned it here once again so that you can connect or you can understand it better now, because a distinctive feature of the poem is how he uses these images, how he uses these phrases, and how through these images and phrases paradoxes and ambiguities are also linked. And these paradoxes or ambiguities I've just explained to you, how the poet is talking about the genuineness of love. He's talking about the universal quality of love, or he's talking about how the surviving quality of the love in the face of everything else. So, but still we find at times the poet becoming skeptic about it. So that gives rise to the paradoxes and the ambiguities. So he's talking about sometimes the frailty of human nature. He doubts the human nature when he says that this act, this was just a whim, this was just a secondary product of the sculptor. It was not the main design. His main design was to create the names, was to list the names, but he says he then, as an afterthought, he made them hold hands. So he says that, you know, the human nature maybe is not faithful. So he's doubting those emotions that he once praises, and fidelity has to do with faithfulness. So the same ideas, the same paradoxes, and the same complexes, the same ambiguities, the same contradictions, they're visible whenever the poet is admiring these emotions. The poem uses words and phrases connected with fixity and death, immobility and stasis, such as still, stone, suspended and bone. Now, an important study of these postmodernist poets is the use of diction. And you'll see that in this poem he uses lots of words which are related to one idea, that is fixity of time, the death of time or emotions, or immobility or stasis. And those words that are used in the poem are still, stone, suspended and bone. And then the poem also has a number of words and phrases which are connected with change and time, such as history, voyage, transfigured and altered. So he, by putting these words against each other in the poem, the effect that he's creating is to show the tension between change and death. This is another main theme of this poem, this tension between change and death or stasis or unchange. So he shows how time moves through history, how this statue has survived through generation, but yet if you remember the phrase where he talked about the stationary, where he says that the statues, the monument, they're stationary yet they move through history. So it is these are the paradoxes, these are the ambiguities, these are the tensions which give beauty to the poem, and which make the poem reflective in tone also. The poem also features a number of images connected with relationship, such as pleat and jointed, to emphasize the central image of the relationship between couple. This is another theme of the poem, which is relationship, this theme of relationship is linked to the theme of love. So the words that he has used for this theme are pleat and jointed, to show that human relationships, they're jointed relationship, and they are relationships which can survive over time, and they are not affected by change, and they remain the same. So the universal theme of love and the unchanging nature of love is explored in the poem. There are other themes that are linked to the same idea, but you shall see that the central theme is the unchanging nature of love, or the survival of love through centuries, and how it remains unaffected due to change in time, due to change in history, change in the passage of time, change in centuries, or change in the mankind or in civilizations. Or he says, although they have remained fixed, they have remained stationary, these statues, in the same way their love has remained stationary, their love has remained unchanged, although they have moved through centuries. So it is that timeless quality of love that is a central theme of the poem. But yet, let me remind you again, there is a cynical attitude of the poet, and that you need to also mention when you're discussing this timeless quality of love. Finally, the poem makes use of imagery and phrasing which suggests the notion of lack of clarity. Words like blurred and almost, which emphasize the central motive of not perhaps seeing clearly or truly. So there is this lack of clarity also when he uses these words like blurred and almost. So he's trying to imply that he is not clear. He's unsure himself whether these people actually were real, whether these people, because they don't have distinct faces. So he says whether they were actual people, whether they were real, whether they did have an identity. And then the effect of the use of imagery is to produce a poem which is extremely rich and suggestive in meaning, where the imagery is itself integral to the meaning of the poem. And you can see that without this imagery, without these images, the meaning of the poem is lost. So the imagery forms an integral part to the meaning of the poem. So this was the first poem by Larkin that we have analyzed in today's lecture. And you can see how complex the poem becomes as the imagery becomes complex, as the ideas become complex. But when you analyze Larkin, you have to pay attention, you have to pay close attention to the movement of the words, and you have to pay close attention to the diction and the kind of words that he uses, because those words are used to create paradoxes. They are used to create ambiguities. They are used to create contradictions. They are used to create confusion in the mind of the readers. And these contradictions and these ambiguities lend beauty to the poem. And they also increase the lyrical beauty of the poem. But we find that hidden within these paradoxes, ambiguities and contradictions is the poet's own cynicism and skepticism. And this is why he uses these paradoxes or ambiguities, because the poet himself is unsure. So he talks about a timeless theme, he talks about a timeless idea or concept, but he at the same time he shows his own, through his own reflective manner, he shows his own attitude towards that idea or towards that concept. But the whole poem is beautifully linked and forms a harmonious whole, and it does not appear to be disjointed or disorganized. So it offers a beautiful a blend of all literary devices. We come to the end of the lecture with this discussion on this poem by Larkin. In the next lecture, I shall discuss another poem of Larkin with you, another very famous poem of Larkin. So I take leave from you for now. I shall meet you again in the next lecture, and we shall discuss another poem by Larkin. Thank you very much.